A ball is thrown vertically upward with an initial velocity of 96 feet per second. The distance s in feet of the ball from the ground after t seconds is st equals 96t minus 16t squared. Part A says, at what time t will the ball strike the ground? So keep in mind, a ball is thrown upward with an initial velocity of 96 feet per second, and it says the distance s in feet of the ball from the ground after t seconds is this function st. So st is the distance of the ball from the ground. So when it's on the ground, think about what that means. That means my st would be 0 because my st is the distance s of the ball from the ground, s in feet. Okay, so that means that st would have to be 0. That's what we're looking at here. So that means I'm going to say 96t minus 16t squared equals 0. And that's what I'm really going to solve here to find out when this ball is on the ground. So I'm going to write 96t minus 16t squared equals 0. And the way I'm going to solve this is using factoring. So I'm just going to factor this. So 96 and 16 have 16 in common. And that means I can pull a 16 out of both of those. And I can also pull a t out. And that will leave us with inside 6 here, because I pulled the t, and that would be minus t equals 0. And from here, that tells me to solve this, t would equal 0 or t would equal 6. And again, I'm just looking at what I can plug in here to make it 0. So if I put 0 there, it's going to 0 times anything. Whatever happens in here is going to be 0. And if I plug in a 6 here, what's 6 minus 6? It's 0. So then I have 0 times all this, which is still 0. So it's 0 and 6 for t here. So now, at what time does the ball strike the ground? It's thrown at t equals 0, so it's not going to be t equals 0. That's where it starts at. But it strikes the ground at t equals 6 seconds. And that's what we're looking for here. So it strikes the ground at 6 seconds. So I would say t equals 6 seconds. Done. Okay, now part B says, for what time t is the ball more than 128 feet above the ground? Now keep in mind what we're dealing with here too. This helps me with this problem immensely, just to understand the picture. And I don't have to understand it exactly, but I do know I'm dealing with this parabola that's opening downward. And the reason why I know that is because this is a t squared and that's a t. And look at this, it's negative on my leading coefficient, so that tells me there that I'm dealing with a downward parabola. And it's a parabola, so that helps me when I'm dealing with this. So now I'm looking for when I'm 128 feet above the ground. So that means my ST then is going to equal 128 feet because that's the distance s in feet of the ball from the ground after t seconds. So that's going to be the height of the ball. So that's what my ST is. So I'm going to put 128 equals 96t minus 16t squared. And I'm just going to move everything to the left side there and really just set this up to be solved. So this is going to be 16t squared minus 96, let me fix my 9, 96t plus 128 and equals 0. And if you look at all of these numbers here, 16, 96, and 128, 16 actually goes into all three of those numbers. So what I could do is I could divide both sides by 16. And that's really a good idea to do here, just to get rid of those large numbers. I think that's really handy. So then I end up with t squared minus 6t, and then 128. 16 goes into 128 8 times, so that'll be a plus 8 equals 0. So now this is much more manageable to actually factor by hand if possible. And let's see if it is, and it is. So this is going to be t minus 4 and t minus 2. The signs have to be the same because this is a plus 8, and that equals 0. So that means t equals 4 or 2. Those are my two answers for t. So for what time is the ball more than 128 feet? So think about this. If I'm looking at this parabola here, and I know it equals 128 at 4 and 2, so this is what I have going on. And at 2, it's above. And let's call this 4 over here, it's above, or it's equal to, excuse me. So that means in that interval, it'll be actually above 128 feet. So at 2 and 4, it's equal to 128. And since it's downward, it'll be between those two numbers where it's actually greater than 128. And that's what's nice about looking at the picture, just to get a rough idea of what's happening with this. And it makes a lot of sense when you can do that. So I would write, and it just says more than. It didn't say more than or equal to. So then my answer for this would be 2 to 4. And I would use parentheses because it says just more than, so not equal to. So this would be my answer for this. And that's an interval. It's not a point. So be careful with that. Even though I can write a point exactly like that interval, we got to take everything into context here. So that's how I could represent the answer for that second piece. So between 2 and 4 is really what that's saying.